All right, welcome to my presentation on CSS Grid. New CSS tool came out earlier this year, early 2017. If you don't know, if you're watching this, you don't know who I am. My name is Tommy, and welcome again. Before we get started, I wanted to recognize a couple of resources that I found very helpful and that actually helped me build this presentation. I took examples from both of them. I figured both of them had things that I liked, but there were also things in there that I thought didn't need to be in there, which is why I decided to make my own presentation. I also think that it's important for the team to have it broken down by their own team member. Basically, the first one that I want to tell everybody about is the Mormon Church's grid workshop on YouTube. And this, I can share the resource. Both of these are in the resources slide, and I'll share this resources slide with everybody, and the slides themselves are public, so you can go and view them whenever you want. But they had a very good workshop internally about CSS Grid. The CodePen exercises come from this presentation. I took them. I thought they were perfect examples. I didn't need to build on them really at all. And so that's some of their code snippets also come. I put in here as well. And the next presentation is Morten Rand Hendrickson's talk at WordCamp Europe. He talks about CSS Grid in that talk, and it was very good. I thought it was very good. It broke down the terms. It was very educational in terms of here's the vocabulary, here's what the vocabulary means, because I think that part is important, which the Mormon Church's workshop got into a little bit, but there was a little bit of haziness. I thought they missed a couple of things. Also, their presentation is very long. So Morten Rand Hendrickson breaks down the terms in very precise and easy to understand and visual way that I really appreciated. And so I tried to pull some examples from him into this presentation. It's broken up differently. It's not exactly the same as theirs, but they both also reference CSS Tricks CSS Grid Guide. And this is some of Morton's definitions come straight from this guide. This is an important guide, and I recommend that everybody check it out when they have a chance. So here we are, CSS. We're going to be talking about CSS Grid today, obviously. As I'm sure everybody knows, I'm a huge advocate of CSS Grid. I've been working with it since I built the career site back in April. And it's been amazing. CSS Grid was officially rolled out in March of this year, like I said before, and it's ready to use right this moment. So even if you don't feel like you're like, well, it's a new technology, I have to take time to learn it, it's ready right now. And I think it's very important that we all see that we all understand that, and that we all start implementing it in our designs and in our development as front-enders specifically. My goal today is to teach, and to show you to convince you to use CSS Grid, to teach you some of the basics to get you started with CSS Grid, because it doesn't take that much. And I know some of us have already experimented with it, and it's pretty powerful. And that's what I want to show you, is how powerful it can be. Because even if you've played with it a little bit, there might be some things that I'll show you today that you're going to be like, whoa. And so hopefully I can accomplish those goals. The way that we have been doing, and Morten talks about this, the way that we have been doing positioning and layouts in CSS is we're hacking our way through it, basically. You have position absolute with position relative. We have floats, which are a hack because you need clear fixes to make it work properly, or overflow or whatever. But they're just not we have to be really, really clever. And not that CSS Grid makes it that much simpler or that much easier to do it. It is simpler. So you can still be clever with CSS Grid, but you don't have to break your brain to think about these things. And Flexbox came along to try and fix some of this hackiness with the positioning that we had. And it's great. I've been learning Flexbox for the last month or so. I'm about halfway through this course that I'm taking, and it's great. Some of the things are common. Some things between Flexbox and Grid are common, and so I am able to work my way through. But I don't have a ton of experience with Flexbox, and I've never used it in production. So CSS Grid is really where I started, and you can take it with a grain of salt. Maybe you're a Flexbox person and you know exactly how it works and it works perfectly for you, but I'll tell you why Grid came along to augment Flexbox and make it better in certain ways. What I can tell you is Flexbox helped solve a lot of the bootstrap type of issues that we've seen. So like class upon class, div upon div, just nesting of an absolute gross mess of nesting. And it allowed us to make really flexible, really responsive layouts with fewer tricks and definitely cleaner code. So you might be asking yourself, okay, so Flexbox came along and it did help fix some things. So why do we need Grid? Well, that's a really good question. Flexbox has a couple of weaknesses, and I have them pointed out here on the slide. One is that it's items based. Basically what that means is you set up an area and then you manually tell each item how to play in that area. You don't even have to set up an area. You can just have the items and you place them in a spot according to what you tell each individual item to do. If you have a couple of different items that are doing different things than the other items, you have to tell those things to do those different things. The other thing is one-dimensional. It only works one way. It either works horizontally or vertically. So if you want a two-dimensional layout, you would need to wrap some group of items in a separate container and call display flex on that container. So you're still putting a div around, you're making a container, you're putting items in that container, you're putting a div around certain items and not around others because they don't play well together in terms of the flex. Grid helps solve those problems. Here are the two things that Grid does better than Flexbox. Grid is container-based. So almost everything, there are two properties that go on the item, and they are the tiniest properties you'll find. Everything else is on the container. All of the widths of the columns and the rows are on the container, not on. You don't have to size the items specifically for a specific track or a specific area. You size the area, you put the item inside of it. All you do is declare display grid on the container. You define the columns and rows that the items will fall into, and the layout works from the container in. The second thing is like I just mentioned, Grid is two-dimensional. That means that it implements columns and rows at the same time. So you don't have to have extra containers. Okay, so it solves Flexbox's problems, but it was just released. How much support does it actually have? Well, in March, Firefox, Chrome, and Safari all release the same working version of CSS Grid. Internet Explorer obviously won't be supporting it. You have to put a flag on it. And Edge is really close. Okay, Edge is super close. I heard an update that in the middle of October they should have the same spec as the other 4 major browsers, and we'll be good to go. You can take that. You still need the flag for Internet Explorer, but Edge will be a working spec. Having said that, though, having said all of that, if it weren't for Internet Explorer, for Microsoft in general, or Internet Explorer 10, CSS Grid wouldn't be around. So there is that. And what I mean by that is that Microsoft invented CSS Grid, they invented Grid, they invented a different spec. The other browsers took that spec and made adjustments to it, and Internet Explorer and Edge, or at least Edge, is has to catch up. And this is how close they are. Look, see, they're really close. And like I said, it'll be the middle of October. So they're really, really, really close. Okay, so now you might be asking, all right, so it's in working condition and fully implemented in all major browsers, but is anyone even using it yet? Like, why are we even talking about this right now? And I would say that that's a wonderful question. A couple of examples. The New York Times is using this. I believe the Mormon Church, like I said, they did a workshop. I believe they're moving they're moving over to it. We are using this on the career site. I think in a couple of other digital properties. Eric used it on the Casper site, I believe. The first place I used it in production was the career site, like I said, and I also used it on the offer pillow page as well. So let's take a look at the code. So if we go in and we inspect these items, this is the first place that I ever used it. And so we have the container here, the unordered list with an ID of posts, and we call display grid on it. And Firefox, I'm using Firefox. Firefox, the benefit of Firefox is they have this built-in grid hash thing here that if you click on it, you can visually see the grid displayed. And if you look, I have no positioning here. There's no positioning here. I declared a height on them, but everything else, like the padding doesn't need to be here. The margin technically doesn't need to be here. It's a fallback. Justify content helps it center. Grid gap gives a gap. We'll talk about all that stuff later, but this is really where it's at. Right here. This is it. This is what's making them all fit nicely together, and they all do. They all settle in there. And I don't have media queries for this. There are no media queries for this. There are for the spacing between the list items, but that's it. Everything else is set up without media queries. I don't have to do any extra work on that. So at this point, you're totally bought in, and hopefully totally bought in, and you're saying to yourself, after seeing a working example, you're like, okay, I'm totes down to start using the grid right now, but I know nothing or almost nothing about it. And that's a wonderful observation, and that leads me to the next slide. We're going to try to make some stuff. Like I said, I was watching the Mormon Church's front-end team's internal workshop, and I thought, hey, I love grid, and I want everyone else on my team to love it also. Why not show them why they should love it? Show them. So I think it would be a good idea. You don't have to participate. This is a short Google URL. I figured that would be the easiest way. You can also go into the slides, and I'll leave a link to the slides after the presentation, or if you're watching this, watching the recording, it'll be in Confluence or otherwise. If you go to this URL, this will take you to the CodePen. Hopefully you have a CodePen set up, and we're gonna make some stuff. So take about 5 minutes if you're watching this, watching the recording. Take about 5 or so minutes. Take your time. Pause the video. Go in CodePen and try and set this up and try and create this grid. All right. So hopefully after you've taken the time to make the grid, you saw, okay, this is how much stuff I needed, and note the number of lines it took for you to solve that problem. And we'll come back to that. We will talk about that and how many lines it'll actually take. For something like this, with Flexbox, I think it would take like 5 or 6 lines of extra code, not the widths and the max width and all that other stuff, but the extra lines for the layout. I think it would take about 5 or 6 with Flexbox, and double that with other tools, floats, and display and inline block and all that other stuff. But we're going to move on to CSS Grid terminology part 1, and we'll circle back to that example. And we're going to talk about right now grid container, grid track, and grid gap. This is CSS Grid terminology part 1. So the grid container is the parent element that is defined by display grid. So put display grid on the container. Okay, so just like that, display grid, right? And so you can do that on the example. If you erase all the code in your example, and you put display grid on the container, we'll move on to the next step. Next is grid track. Grid track is the space between two or more adjacent grid lines. And we'll talk about what grid lines are in CSS in the terminology part 2. But basically you can see with the examples highlighted that those are grid tracks. Columns and the rows that take up two or more blocks is a track. And this brings me to the next big piece, which is grid template columns and grid template rows. This is what defines your layout. There are other pieces, but this will get you started with CSS Grid. They can take any unit of length that anything else will take. Percentage, viewport width, viewport height, pixels. I believe they'll take I'm sure they'll take Ms and Rems. That sounds a little bit complicated, but you know, to each their own. Basically, you can set it up so you have grid template columns, and this is a 4-column grid, each 200 pixels wide. You can have a shortened version of it, which it utilizes the repeat keyword, and you set up 4, so you indicate the columns, the number of columns, and then each of them is 200 pixels. And you can put different sizes in here, and we can talk about that also. You don't have to be even either. The tracks don't have to be even. So you can mix and match them, 200, 400, 600. You can do whatever you want. And then grid template rows is exactly the same thing. It operates in the same way, except for one thing. I believe that there's going to be one unit of measurement that's brand new that we'll talk about in a second that doesn't operate the same on template rows as it does on columns. I haven't figured that out yet. I'm not an expert on grid. I should have said that at the beginning. I'm not an expert on grid. I really, really like grid, and I think that people should be using it more often. And I think that I honestly think that everybody should scrap all of their layouts, redo them in grid as much as they can, and I think the world would be a better place. But we'll talk about that later. So anyway, I would recommend putting this in grid template columns, repeat 400 pixels, and grid template rows, same. And then we can go on. The next thing I want to talk about is the new unit, the FR unit. It stands for fraction unit. It takes up one portion of the available space left in the grid. I will show you an example of what that means in a minute. But the other thing you need to note is that all fraction units act in relation to each other. I'll show you exactly what those things mean in just a second. So let's go to an example. So we have these two here. We have 2 columns, 4 items. These are taking up equal space, these are taking up equal space. And they're each taking, all of them, each column, is a fraction of the width of the page, or the width of the remaining width of the container. And this is totally flexible. It'll flex all the way down. It might not be 100% practical, like you might have to move these stacking underneath and push these out a little bit, but that's one media query. But basically this is taking up about, I'd say 25% of the about 25, maybe 30% of the width of the container, and this is taking up about 70 to 75% of the width of the container. And they're relative to each other. So this column is 75% of the width. This will be 25% of the width unless specified otherwise. So it could be that if we set this to the same number as this, they will each be taking up 50% of the width of the container. And I'll show you what that means right now. So let's look at the code. So here we have 2.75. This is taking up about 70%. This is taking up about 30%. Let's change this to 2.75. Now they're taking up 50%. So they're each taking up an equal portion of the remaining width of the container. It would take a little bit of working with it to fully, I think, to fully capture it, and if you haven't yet. But I think that this is a very strong example of how powerful grid is and how powerful grid can be. We are going, yeah, okay. Now this is another one. This is a flexible layout, so you have random items here on the page, and you have some content inside. Okay, you can make this content 100% flexible. So you'd have to change the spacing probably when you get down to mobile, and you'd have to obviously change the left and right columns. But this is, you don't need a media query for this. This is absolutely works on its own. Okay, let's go back to full screen and we'll move on. All right, so here, the next thing is grid gap, is the empty space between grid tracks or grid cells. We'll talk about grid cells in a minute. Basically, they're the gutters, right? So if you have a grid gap shorthand is, sorry, the shorthand for grid gap is grid gap. It stands for grid row gap and grid column gap. Grid row gap, and it's in that order too, by the way. So if you have, if you have grid row gap 20 pixels, grid column gap 20 pixels, or you can shorthand it to grid gap 20 pixels, or you can use two values. The first value is always row. If the column is not defined, this is the second value is the column. If it's not defined, then it's going to default to the grid row gap number. And so for this example, we would declare this on the container as well. I don't remember if I mentioned that for this one, declared on the container, right? So this is declared on the container. This is also declared on the container. Grid gap 10 pixels. So if you go through and you look at the rest of your code, this is what you should have. You should replace all of that positioning stuff. Just put this in here, and it should work. Margin 0 auto, I believe, or you can use justify content center, and it will center itself, and that's all that you need. 4 lines of code to do the positioning of 10 lines of code. And it's amazing, super powerful, great stuff. So this is what, after we call grid gap on the grid container, this is what our code looks like. So if you go ahead and delete the code that you put in to make the layout for that grid layout, the simple grid layout, and replace it with this, it should all work. Now, granted, you might have moved around or changed measurements for widths or other things like that. You can change it back or try and figure it out or leave them or whatever you want. And if you have margin 0 auto on, it should center. If not, you can do justify content center, and it will on the container, and it should center that way as well. So you can take a minute to do that. And in the meantime, we're going to summarize in 2 simple steps. This is how I would summarize CSS Grid. Now, this is not mine. The credit goes to Morten Rand Hendrickson for the summary. I thought it was succinct, and it was a perfect way to explain CSS Grid to somebody who is like, well, CSS Grid, what is it, and how do I use it? So this is how number one, step 1, you define a grid. On the container, you define it. Step 2, you place items in that grid. And step 3, you profit. The third step is mine. I thought it was funny. You can laugh if you want. If not, fine. If you're a South Park fan, you might get it. Moving on. This is an example. You can try to do this if you want. You can pause the video, try to get this to work. If not, that's fine. We're going to walk through what the code looks like in a minute. You just saw a snippet of it actually just a second ago. But this is a nice little Masonic style. This is not, masonry. So it's a nice masonry style. It's not practical at all in my opinion, but there are a couple of practical pieces in here that are important to know and important to understand, which is why we're looking at it. Excuse me. This is what the Haml and the Sass look like. So we have a container, and we have items in the container, and then we have the CSS. So we call display grid on the container, obviously. We have grid template columns and grid template rows on repeat for 4 and 4. So we have 4 columns, 4 rows. The columns are set to 1FR. The rows are set to 15 viewport height. Now the difference though is here. Last time we didn't have to put anything on the items. This time we do have to put things on the items, but it's very minimal. And this is a close-up of it. It's very small, and if you'll notice, not every item is on here. That's because some of the items fall into place exactly the way that they are. And that's fine. That's the way that we want it. But these do not. And we'll talk about what span and -1 mean. If you notice those and you're like, what are those? We'll talk about that in a second. So this brings us to CSS Grid terminology part 2. We're going to talk about grid item, grid cell, grid line, and grid area. To start, grid item is any child element that is a direct descendant of the grid container. So those. Here we have class of grid. If you call display grid on this, because it's the container and the parent element, all of these children are now grid items and fall into the grid container. Then you have grid cell, is the space between two adjacent rows and two adjacent column grid, two adjacent row and two adjacent column grid lines. So this is a grid line. This is a grid row line. This is a grid column line. This is a grid row line, and this is a grid column line. This box is a grid cell, and it's a grid cell because this area falls into place between two adjacent row and column lines. And we'll talk about what grid lines are in a second. Grid line is defined as the horizontal and vertical lines separating the grid into sections. They can be a number which refers to a specific grid line. I say can be because they can also be named. I don't like that approach as much, which is why I didn't put it in the slide itself, but some people do. They like the visual aspect of it. I like the numbers. It's easier for me to understand. And for example, this is column line 1. This is row line 2. This would be row line 1. And the numbers start and end with the outer borders of the grid. So this is row line 1, or sorry, column line 1. This is column line 2, column line 3, and the end of the grid is this right here, which is column line 4. That brings me to the next thing, span value and the -1 value. The span value, you can see here, we call span on grid column. Now, in order to make this work, in order to set them in place so specifically, you on the item, you call grid column and or grid row. And that will tell it where to go when you define those measurements, those values, when you define those values, you tell it exactly where to go on the grid after you define the grid itself. Span is defined as the item starts where it naturally is and takes up 2 columns and or 2 rows. So here we have a grid column and we call span 2. So it's going to take up 2 columns. Then we have grid row and we call span 2 and it's going to take up 2 rows. So span 2 on the column, span 2 columns, span 2 rows. We could call 3 or 4 or 5 or 6 and it would span the whole way. Or we can call the -1 value. So -1 is defined as the last line in the grid. So you don't have to know exactly how many lines you have on the grid, how many columns or rows you have on the grid. All you have to do, if you have a section, which we often do because we have sections that start at the very beginning of the page and go to the very end of the page, if you have that, you just say 1 \_(-1), and that will span the entire page. Now, that's grid column. If you wanted to go, 2 or 3 rows, you would have to call grid row span 3, and it'll fit into that place exactly where it's at. This, however, is not moved around. So, for instance, I guess everything is in its own place here. This is starting where it's at and moving all the way across to the end of the grid container. There's one more thing to mention, and that is that these properties are defined on the children of the grid container, so on the items of the grid container, not on the grid container itself. So, like before, what I was mentioning with Flexbox, one of its weaknesses is item-based. This and grid area are the only things, we'll talk about grid area in a second, are the only things that go on the item in terms of grid positioning and grid layouts. As opposed to Flexbox, there's a lot more that goes on the items themselves. So, moving on. Grid area, I just mentioned it. It's a total space surrounded by 4 grid lines. So here we have a grid line. 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 And so technically a cell would be a grid area also. But if it's just one area of the one cell, so typically it'd be 2 or more cells would be an area. So this is taking up an area, right? So here's an example. Sorry, let's back up. Here's an example of a layout done with, you can try and do this yourself without CSS Grid also. So you can pause the video, take a few minutes, go to this code pen here, and fork it and do it yourself if you want to. If not, sit back, relax, listen, watch, and I'll show you how it works. Grid template areas is that is the new property. So that grid template areas is exactly like grid template columns and exactly like grid template rows. It works differently. It uses a text-based map to apply grid area names to individual items. I'll tell you what grid area is in just a minute. So it looks like this. Call display grid, that's how we know that this is the container. You call grid template areas, and then you get these, and then you set up the map. So here are the grid area names, right here. These are grid area names. Can I highlight those? I can highlight these. These are grid area names. Oh, you can't see it highlighted. I see it highlighted. Anyway, sorry for that distraction. Header, main, footer are grid area names. And I'll tell you what that means right now. Okay. So you see here, we have the items, the header, the article, and the footer. And those take a grid area, take the grid area property as a, and then take a value as, take any value really, header as a value, and we map that here. And that's how we get this. So header is this, it's a 3-column layout. So if you notice, 3 columns, 1, 2, 3. And the header is defined in 1, 2, 3, all 3 of the columns, no matter the size. So this defines the size. Columns and rows define the size. This tells us where to put it. And all of that works on the grid items. We define that on the grid items, and then we throw it up here. All right, so that's it for the main presentation. I want to show a couple of other things, a couple of other examples that I didn't define and talk about too much that show the power of CSS Grid. So this is the autofill value. We have the keyword repeat and autofill keyword / value, as well as min-max. We're using min-max, so this is also an example of min-max, but autofill specifically, it'll go down and it'll fill in spots. And how you do that is you call min-max, right? So you do repeat, autofill. So if I do repeat, that means that as many columns as I want will autofill into the thing, no matter how many columns I have. So I can set up as many columns as I want. So if I were to expand this, if this were to be on a bigger display, all of the columns would shift up. All of the blocks, the items would shift up to fill in those columns, autofill. Min-max says this can be no smaller than 250 pixels, but no bigger than 1 FR. Remember, 1 FR is 1 fraction unit and takes up the remaining space available to it in the grid. And so it looks like this. So we go down, and it's not going to be less than 250. Once it hits less than 250, then it'll shift down and go up to 1FR. So these are taking up the amount of remaining space in the grid. And to keep doing that, and without media queries, we've created something that is 100% flexible. 100% flexible without media queries. Granted, this is not the most practical example, but it shows the power. Each item, if you look, each item is shifting. So we have this, watch this red piece. It ends up moving and adjusting its size according to the size of the grid. And so that red piece used to be a 1FR, now it's a 3FR. And we go on down from there. So now we have nested grid. There are 3 grids there on this page. One grid is the main grid, or we could call it the body grid, which sets up a header and article in this format, one on top of the other. Then we have the article, which is a grid, which sets up this unordered list, gives it a way to fit in to this limited space. And then the unordered list itself is a grid as well. And this allows the items to be responsive. It also allows the unordered list to be responsive inside of the article as well. So if we had to put more content in there, it would respond accordingly. This is really cool. This allows us to do literal masonry layouts. So grid auto flow, again declared on the container, will, depending on its value, the value that you give the property, will shift things around. So as it is now, if you notice, we have number 1, number 2, number 3, and then because there's no space for it, number 4 is defined differently. It moves down here, and then 5, and then 6, and then 7, and 8. So it goes in order. The DOM, it respects the DOM in that sense. Now, this still respects the DOM, by the way. 1, 2, 3, 4, we would jump around, but this is not pulling anything out of the document. This is just moving, shifting things into places that make it fit. So it all fits. And then we can do the same thing with columns. This one's a little trickier though, because this 5 expands, so it pushes these out and expands the rest of it. And so it also makes this 7 wider, but it's all flexible. So that is a powerful example. And one second. And then, last but not least, is the resources page. Like I said at the beginning, I'm going to post the link to this video so that you will have it, and you can not to the video, sorry, to the slides, so that you'll have it and you'll have access to this resources slide, because these 2 things are how I first Grid by Example website. Rachel Andrews' Grid by Example website has a ton of information on CSS Grid. And Rachel Andrews' Grid by Example tutorial on YouTube, it's a playlist, 19 videos. The longest video is about 8 minutes long, and the average video is about 4 minutes long. So you have time, definitely have time, every morning, every night before bed, at lunch, to go through one of these videos, take notes, 10, maybe 15 minutes while you're taking notes and doing the examples, and go through this tutorial. It's hugely important. I think it's a major thing to do. And then we have CSS Tricks' CSS Grid Guide. They did it on Flexbox also. I don't like the user experience of this guide, but there's a lot of information in there. The definitions are crisp. The examples are clean. It's a good place. It's a good resource. I go to it frequently when I have a question. Then there is like I said at the beginning, like I mentioned at the beginning, the Mormon Church's Grid workshop for their front-end team, their internal workshop on YouTube. The link is here, and I recommend watching that. I would watch it at 1.25 or 1.5 speed because it is a little bit long and they go a little slow. But it's a workshop. It's like a lunch. It's like a lunch and learn or something that they're doing. So it makes sense. And then we have Morten Rand Hendrickson's WordCamp Europe talk. This takes some of the CSS tricks, the CSS grid guides definitions, and puts them in a nice formatted way, a easy way to digest, as well as a nice visual way. And I recommend going and watching his talk 1.25, 1.5 speed because he's talking a little bit slowly. But again, another really good talk about CSS grid. And then Kevin Powell to talk about the implicit and explicit grid. I mentioned earlier about this that we weren't going to be going over it. And that's because I just didn't study up enough and I didn't want this to run too long. But this is the best explanation that I found of what the implicit and explicit grid are. Rachel Andrew goes over it, but Kevin Powell takes it in a little bit of a longer format and expands on it and shows you examples of how it works. And it's wonderful, and it'll help you understand CSS grid much better. And I think that this is important. You can do CSS grid without this, but this will help you write concise CSS grid. Grid area. He also has a video on grid areas layout, on a grid areas layout example. I think that this is a very good example of a grid areas layout. So I would check it out. If you have any questions, feel free to ping me. Feel free to walk up to me and ask me questions. If you have resources you want to share with me, again, feel free. I'm available. But thank you for watching my presentation on CSS Grid, and I'll see you guys later.